Before anyone knew her name, they knew her house. The little blue one on Larkspur Lane with the white picket fence and the wind chimes that never stopped singing. In 2024, a construction crew pulled up a rotted floorboard in that same house and found a rusted lockbox underneath. Inside, one photograph, a single gold earring, and a note that read only, "Forgive me." For 33 years, the people of Ridgewood thought they knew exactly who killed Marissa Cole. They were wrong. And the truth had been living 2 houses down the entire time. But that story starts long before the lockbox. It starts on a hot, restless night in July 1991. Ridgewood was the kind of California town where nothing bad was supposed to happen. Sprinklers hissed at dawn, kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on, neighbors waved from porches and meant it. It was quiet, ordinary, safe, or so everyone believed. Marissa Cole was 24 years old, bright-eyed and newly engaged. She worked at her family's small accounting firm downtown, the kind of job where everybody knew her by name and her laugh carried through the walls. She was planning a wedding for the following spring. She had her whole life ahead of her. That night, a summer storm rolled in fast and violent, the kind that rattles windows and turns the sky the color of a bruise. Thunder cracked over Ridgewood just after 10 p.m. and minutes later, the entire neighborhood lost power. Houses went dark, one after another, like candles being pinched out in a row. By morning, the storm had passed. The sun came up clean and bright as if nothing had happened, but something had. Marissa didn't show up to open the office. She didn't answer her phone. Her mother, worried after 3 unanswered calls, drove to the little blue house on Larkspur Lane and let herself in with her spare key. She found her daughter on the kitchen floor. The screams that followed woke half the street. Detective Ray Odom was 28 years old, still new enough to the badge that his hands shook a little when he pulled up to the scene. He'd handled burglaries, a few bar fights, nothing like this. He stepped through the front door into a house that still smelled faintly of last night's candles lit, he'd learned, because the power had gone out. The living room was undisturbed. No broken glass, no signs of struggle by the entrance. But in the kitchen, Marissa Cole lay still, her eyes open, her hand curled toward the phone on the counter as if she'd been reaching for it and never made it. Odom stood in that doorway a long time, notebook open, pen frozen above the page. Something about the room felt wrong in a way he couldn't yet name. The storm had knocked out the electricity for blocks. Anyone could have slipped in under cover of that darkness, except for one detail that made his stomach turn cold. The front door had been locked from the inside. Odom checked it twice with his own hands, then a third time, refusing to believe it. No forced entry, no broken window, no sign that a stranger had ever come through that door at all. Whoever killed Marissa Cole either had a key or she had let them in herself. Odom closed his notebook, looked out at the small crowd already gathering behind the police tape, and felt something settle in his chest that would stay there for the next 33 years. Someone in Ridgewood already knew the answer. He just had to find out who. By nightfall, word had spread through Ridgewood like fire through dry brush. Marissa Cole was dead. Murdered in her own home behind a locked door while the whole street slept through a blackout. People who had never bothered to lock their doors before suddenly checked them twice. Porch lights that used to switch off by 10 stayed lit until dawn. Fear does strange things to a small town. It turns neighbors into suspects and whispers into truth. Within 2 days, half of Ridgewood had a theory and none of them agreed. At the center of the town's grief stood David Whitfield, Marissa's fiancé. He was 26, well-liked, the kind of young man mothers pointed to as an example. He worked at his father's hardware store on Main Street and had known Marissa since high school. When reporters caught him outside the funeral home, his eyes were red, his voice breaking. "She was going to be my wife," he told them, clutching a framed photo of the two of them at the lake the summer before. "I don't understand how anyone could do this to her." The town wept with him, casseroles piled up on his porch. Women from the church organized a vigil on Larkspur Lane, candles flickering in small paper cups, Marissa's photograph propped against the very fence she used to lean on and wave to passing cars. But grief wasn't the only thing moving through Ridgewood that week. Suspicion was too. A drifter had been spotted near the edge of town 2 nights before the murder, a thin man in a faded army jacket sleeping behind the laundromat, gone by morning. Someone remembered seeing him walk past Larkspur Lane. By Thursday, half the town was certain they'd found their killer, even though no one could say his name, where he'd gone, or whether he'd ever set foot near Marissa's house at all. Detective Ray Odom followed the lead anyway because that was his job. He drove out to the bus station, showed the sketch around, checked the shelters 2 towns over. He found nothing. No name, no record, no trace of a man who existed only in nervous rumor. What he couldn't shake, though, wasn't the drifter. It was David. David Whitfield's alibi was simple. He said he'd been at his parents' house that night waiting out the storm and had gone straight home to bed once the power came back. His parents backed up every word. Nothing about it should have bothered Odom. And yet, sitting across from David during their first interview, Odom noticed something small. When he asked what time David had left Marissa's house earlier that evening, David answered before Odom had even finished the question. "Rehearsed. Too clean." "You two didn't argue that night?" "Nothing at all," Odom asked, watching closely. "No," David said quickly, then softer, almost to himself. "She seemed distracted lately, but we didn't argue." Distracted? Odom wrote the word down and circled it twice. It was a small thing. Grief made people say strange things, made memories blur and details slip. Odom told himself that more than once, driving home that night past the still-lit candles on Larkspur Lane. But something about the phrase stayed lodged in his mind like a splinter he couldn't quite reach. Distracted by what, or by whom, he didn't know it yet, but that single word would crack the case wide open and lead him somewhere no one in Ridgewood expected to look. That one word, distracted, sent Odom back to Larkspur Lane a week later, this time with a search warrant in hand. Marissa's mother had given permission to go through the house again, insisting there had to be something the first walkthrough had missed. She was right. Tucked inside a shoebox at the top of Marissa's closet, beneath a stack of sweaters she hadn't worn since spring, Odom found a bundle of letters tied together with a faded ribbon. No envelopes, no return address, just folded paper, soft at the creases from being read again and again. He sat on the edge of her bed and read them one by one. They weren't signed with a full name, only a single initial. G. The letters spoke of stolen afternoons and late-night phone calls, of a love that had to stay hidden because people would never understand. One line near the bottom of the last letter made Odom's jaw tight. I know I promised things would change. Give me time, she doesn't have to know. She's someone's wife. It didn't take long for Odom to connect the initial to a name. Gerald Ashby was 43, married for 18 years, and owned 3 successful properties across Ridgewood, including the strip mall where Marissa's accounting office did its books. He sat on the town council. He'd shaken Odom's hand at a fundraiser only months before. Odom brought him in for questioning on a Tuesday afternoon. Gerald arrived in a press shirt, sleeves rolled, smiling the easy smile of a man who believed his reputation would carry him through anything. The smile didn't last. I want to ask you about Marissa Cole, Odom said, sliding the folded letters across the table. Gerald's eyes flicked down, then away. I don't know what you mean. These were found in her bedroom. Signed G. You do business with her firm. You're on the town council with her father-in-law to be. Seems like quite a coincidence. Lots of people's names start with G. Gerald forced a laugh that came out thin and unconvincing. Odom leaned forward. Where were you the night of the storm, Mr. Ashby? Home. With my wife. His voice had climbed half an octave. A bead of sweat slid from his temple and he wiped it away too casually, like he hoped Odom hadn't noticed. Your wife will confirm that. Of course she will. A pause too long. Why wouldn't she? Odom said nothing, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Gerald shifted in his seat, cleared his throat, straightened his collar, though it needed no straightening. Look, Gerald finally said, voice dropping. Marissa and I, it wasn't what you think. It was over months ago. I ended it. I have a family, a business, a reputation in this town. I did not hurt that girl. Then you won't mind if we take a look at your car, your clothes from that night, your phone records. Gerald's composure cracked just slightly, a flash of panic behind his eyes before he steadied himself again. Talk to my lawyer, he said quietly and stood, his chair scraping loud against the floor. Odom watched him walk out, letters still sitting on the table between them, and felt the same cold certainty he'd felt standing over Marissa's body. Someone in this town was lying. But suspicion wasn't proof. Gerald's wife confirmed his alibi without hesitation. No fingerprints tied him to the scene. No physical evidence placed him anywhere near Larkspur Lane that night. The affair was real. The motive maybe, but the case against Gerald Ashby was built entirely of paper, letters, rumors, a word scrawled in a notebook. And paper, Odom would soon learn, wasn't nearly enough to hold a case together for long. Weeks turned into months, and the trail that once felt so promising began to dry up entirely. Gerald Ashby's lawyer made sure no further questioning happened without a formal charge, and there was nothing to charge him with. No fingerprints on the locked front door except Marissa's own. No fibers, no footprints in the flower beds, no witness who had seen a car parked outside Larkspur Lane during the storm. Whoever had walked through that door had done it clean. Odom pushed anyway. He re-interviewed neighbors twice, sometimes 3 times, hoping a detail forgotten in shock might surface with time. Most people had little patience left for his questions. A woman 2 doors down finally snapped at him on her porch. I already told you everything I know. Let that poor family grieve in peace. Ridgewood wanted to move on. Ridgewood wanted its quiet back. The police department wanted the same thing. Odom's captain called him into his office on a gray October morning, arms crossed, voice flat with the kind of tired finality that comes after too many dead ends. You've had 4 months on this, Ray. We've got 2 burglaries and a hit and run stacking up. Need you back on active cases. I'm close, Odom said, though even he wasn't sure he believed it anymore. The affair, the locked door, someone knew her, someone she trusted. Knowing isn't proving. The captain slid a new folder across the desk, a clear end to the conversation. Keep the file open, but it's not your only job anymore. That was how cold cases died in towns like Ridgewood, not with a decision, but with a slow, quiet starvation of attention, one reassigned detective at a time. The hardest visit came a week later when Marissa's mother, Ruth Cole, showed up at the station unannounced. She looked 10 years older than she had at the funeral, her hands twisting a handkerchief that had long since stopped being useful for tears and had become simply something to hold on to. Tell me you haven't given up, she said, standing in front of Odom's desk. Please, she was my only daughter. I haven't, Odom said, and meant it. But Mrs. Cole, I don't have enough, not yet. Enough for what? For you to sleep at night while whoever did this walks around this town, buys groceries, goes to church. Her voice cracked on the last word. Somebody in Ridgewood knows what happened to my little girl. Somebody is lying to you. Odom didn't have an answer for her. He never would, not for a very long time. He walked her out that day with a promise he wasn't sure he could keep, and he watched her drive away, taillights disappearing around the corner of Larkspur Lane, the same street where it had all begun. Over the following years, Leeds went nowhere. Gerald Ashby moved his business 2 towns over and was rarely seen in Ridgewood again. David Whitfield eventually left, too, unable to walk past the little blue house without his chest tightening. The drifter was never found, never named, and eventually stopped being mentioned at all. By 1994, the file on Marissa Cole's murder was officially marked unsolved. Boxed up, labeled, and slid onto a shelf in the evidence room where it would sit gathering dust for the next 30 years, a name and a photograph waiting for someone someday to finally open the box again. 32 years passed. Ridgewood grew, changed, paved over its old dirt lots, and built a shopping center where the drive-in theater used to stand. New families moved into Larkspur Lane, unaware their pretty blue house once sat at the center of the town's darkest unsolved mystery. Marissa Cole became a name only the oldest residents remembered, spoken occasionally, softly, usually followed by a shake of the head and the words, "Such a shame. Never did find out who did it." But some things in Ridgewood hadn't changed at all. The case file was still there, sitting exactly where it had been left, in a records room that time seemed to have forgotten entirely. In 2023, Detective Alina Vance transferred into the Ridgewood Police Department's newly formed Cold Case Unit, a small team of 2, tasked with digging through decades of unanswered questions using tools that hadn't existed when most of those cases went cold. She was 31, sharp, and had a reputation for refusing to let a file rest until she'd read every page twice. The evidence room hadn't been touched in years. Vance pushed the door open and was met with a wall of stale, dust-heavy air, the kind that made her cough before she'd taken 3 steps inside. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, one bulb dead entirely, casting the rows of metal shelving in a dim, uneven glow. Cardboard boxes sagged under their own weight, labels faded to near illegibility, spiderwebs strung between the corners like something out of a forgotten attic. She found the box marked Cole M 1991 unsolved on the bottom shelf, half crushed beneath heavier files that had been stacked on top of it for decades. She had to kneel on the cold concrete floor to pull it free. Before she opened it, she made one phone call. Ray Odom was 70 years old now, retired 11 years, and fighting a heart condition that had slowed him down more than he liked to admit. He answered on the 3rd ring, and when Vance said the name Marissa Cole, there was a long pause on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that told her everything she needed to know about how much that name still weighed on him. They met at a small coffee shop near his house 2 days later. Odom moved slowly, leaning on a cane, but his eyes were sharp, alert in a way that surprised her. He set a worn leather notebook on the table between them, its cover cracked and soft with age. "Everything I ever thought about that case is in there," he said. "Every hunch I never got to prove. I always figured somebody in that town knew more than they said. I just ran out of time to prove it." Vance opened the notebook carefully, scanning pages of cramped handwriting, names, dates, the word distracted circled twice in fading blue ink. "Why give this to me now?" she asked. Odom looked at her for a long moment, something between hope and exhaustion in his expression. "Because I won't be around to see it finished, but you might be able to do what I couldn't." He tapped the cover once, gently, like he was saying goodbye to an old friend. Marissa deserves to have her name mean something other than a cold case number. Find out who locked that door. Vance closed the notebook, and for the first time in over 3 decades, the case of Marissa Cole was once again wide open. Vance spent the next few weeks buried in the old file, cross-referencing Odom's notebook against the original crime scene report. Most of the physical evidence had degraded over 3 decades, but one item had survived, sealed and forgotten in a small paper envelope, a fingernail scraping taken from Marissa's right hand during the original autopsy. In 1991, the lab could only confirm it belonged to someone other than the victim. In 2023, that single scraping meant something entirely different. Vance sent it to a private forensic genealogy lab that specialized in cold cases just like this one, a method that hadn't existed when Odom first walked into that kitchen. It compared DNA not just against criminal databases, but against public genealogy sites, building family trees from the smallest genetic fragments left behind. The wait felt endless. 6 weeks passed before the report landed in her inbox, and when it did, Vance read the first line twice, certain she'd misunderstood. Partial match identified. Estimated relationship, first-degree relative of subject in comparative database, Ray's family line. She sat back in her chair, staring at the screen. Ray's, not Ashby, not the drifter, who after all these years of searching had never even been confirmed to exist beyond a single nervous rumor. Ray's. Vance pulled up everything she could find on the name in connection to Marissa Cole, and it took only minutes to find it, buried in old witness statements nobody had thought to flag as important. Carol Ray's had been Marissa's best friend since childhood, maid of honor in a wedding that never happened. And Carol's husband, Tom Ray's, had barely appeared in the original file at all. One line in Odom's handwriting from 1991, T. Ray's spoke briefly, nothing notable, alibi W. wife. Nothing notable, he had been standing in plain sight the entire time, married to the victim's closest friend, and no one had thought to look twice. Vance called Odom that evening and she could hear him go quiet on the other end of the line, the same heavy silence from their first conversation. Tom Reyes, he repeated slowly. I remember him, quiet fella. Carol did all the talking whenever we came around. The DNA under her fingernails is a family match to him, Vance said. Not conclusive yet, but close enough that I need to bring him in. After 32 years, Odom's voice was barely above a whisper. I looked at Gerald Ashby, I looked at some drifter who might not have even been real. And the whole time he was standing right next to the investigation, Vance finished for him. 2 houses down from Larkspur Lane, he still lives there, Ray, he never left. The revelation rippled through what remained of the old case file like a stone dropped into still water. Every assumption from 1991 had to be re-examined. Gerald Ashby, guilty of betrayal but nothing more, had been the town's easiest villain because his affair made him look the part. The drifter had been a convenient ghost, blamed because fear needed somewhere to land. But the real answer had never needed to hide behind mystery or scandal. It had needed only proximity and 32 years of nobody asking the right question. Vance closed her laptop that night, the weight of what she'd found settling over her like the dust in that old evidence room. Somewhere across town, in a modest house 2 streets from where Marissa Cole had died, a 70-year-old man was living out his quiet retirement, completely unaware that science had just done what silence never could. It had finally found him. A DNA match was a lead, not a motive. Vance knew that finding out what connected Tom Reyes to Marissa's death mattered just as much as finding out who he was. So she went back further, past the 1991 file entirely, into the financial records of Cole and Whitmore Accounting, the small firm where Marissa had worked. The same firm that handled the books for half the businesses in Ridgewood, including a modest construction company owned and operated by Tom Reyes. It took 2 days of digging through digitized archives before Vance found it, a set of ledgers from early 1991, flagged internally but never followed up on. Someone had noticed discrepancies in the Reyes construction accounts months before Marissa died, invoices padded, payments logged twice, small amounts skimmed off larger contracts over nearly 2 years. The kind of theft that was easy to miss unless someone was looking closely. And Marissa had been looking closely. Her initials were on the flagged file. Vance found what she needed next in an old audio cassette, of all things recorded interviews Odom had conducted with Marissa's coworkers back in 1991, transcripts filed but never fully analyzed because nobody had known which thread to pull. One statement from a coworker named Diane stood out. Marissa was working late a lot those last few weeks. She seemed stressed. Kept saying she had to talk to somebody about doing the right thing, even if it hurt someone she cared about. The right thing, even if it hurt someone she cared about. Vance pieced together the rest through old letters Carol Reyes had once written to Marissa, tucked away with the rest of the correspondence collected from the house in 1991 but never fully read for context. One, dated just 3 weeks before the murder, painted the clearest picture yet. Marissa, I know what you found in Tom's accounts. Please don't say anything yet. He's under so much pressure with the business. I'm begging you as your friend, give him time to fix it. I don't know what he'd do if this got out. Carol reading between those lines decades later, Vance could almost hear the conversation that must have followed, the one no letter had recorded, the one that had likely taken place face-to-face in the days before the storm rolled into Ridgewood. She imagined it clearly, Marissa sitting across from Carol at her kitchen table, voice gentle but firm. Carol, I have to report it. It's not just Tom's business anymore, it's the firm's name on those books too. If this comes out later and it looks like we knew we could lose everything we've built. Please, Carol would have said, gripping her friend's hand. Just a little more time. He's not a bad man, Marissa. He's scared. Give him a chance to make it right on his own. I've given him 3 months already. He loves you like a sister. He wouldn't. I'm not saying he would do anything, Carol. I'm saying I can't keep pretending I didn't see it. There was no way to know exactly how that conversation ended, but the fear in Carol's letter was unmistakable, not fear for herself, but fear of what her husband might do if cornered, if exposed, if the life he'd built on quiet theft came crashing down all at once. Vance sat with that letter for a long time, the weight of it settling heavy in her chest. Marissa hadn't been threatening a stranger. She'd been trying to do right by her job while protecting a friendship she clearly still valued, unaware that the very loyalty she extended may have been the thing that sealed her fate. Somewhere in Ridgewood, Carol Reyes was still alive, still married to Tom, still carrying whatever she had known or suspected for over 3 decades. It was time Vance paid her a visit. Carol Reyes lived alone now in a small house on the edge of town, her husband's construction business long since sold, her children grown and scattered to other states. When Vance knocked on her door on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, she found a frail woman in her 60s, silver-haired and stooped, who looked at the badge in Vance's hand like she'd been waiting 32 years for someone to finally show it to her. I wondered when someone would come, Carol said quietly, stepping aside to let her in. The living room was neat, filled with photographs, grandchildren, a wedding, a life that had continued forward even as something old and unspoken sat underneath it all. Carol sat across from Vance with her hands folded tightly in her lap, the same nervous grip she must have carried since 1991. I found a letter you wrote to Marissa, Vance said gently, sliding a photocopy across the coffee table. About Tom, about what she'd found in his books. Carol's eyes filled instantly and she pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. I've read that letter in my head 1,000 times since she died, wondering if it's the reason. Did you know what Tom did that night? The question hung in the air a long time. Carol's silence answered before her words caught up. I didn't know, she finally whispered. Not for certain, not then. Her voice cracked. But I suspected. God help me, I suspected almost right away. Why didn't you say anything? Carol looked up, eyes red, decades of buried guilt breaking loose all at once. Because he came home that night soaked from the storm, shaking, and wouldn't tell me where he'd been. Because for weeks after he flinched every time her name came up. Because I was scared, detective, scared of what it would mean for our children if their father was a murderer, scared of what people would think of me for staying, scared that if I said the wrong thing out loud, it would make it real. Marissa was your best friend, Vance said, not unkindly but firm. She died protecting your family's name in a way, and you let an innocent man's reputation and a stranger's face carry the blame for over 30 years. Carol flinched like she'd been struck. You think I don't know that? You think I haven't carried that every single day? Tears spilled freely now, her composure gone. I told myself I was protecting my children, but really I was protecting myself. I was a coward and Marissa paid for it with her life, and I've paid for it every night since, lying awake next to a man I was too afraid to leave and too ashamed to report. Where is Tom now? Vance asked quietly. Carol's hands shook as she wiped her face. Still in that house, 2 streets from Larkspur Lane. He never wanted to move, said it would look suspicious. A hollow, broken laugh escaped her. 32 years, and it never once occurred to him that staying might be the most suspicious thing of all. Vance stood, gathering the photocopy back into her folder, watching the woman across from her fold inward with the weight of everything she'd just admitted. You'll need to come in and give an official statement, Vance said gently. Carol nodded, wiping her eyes one last time. I should have done this a long time ago. Maybe if I had, this wouldn't have taken so long. Vance left the house with the address burned into her mind, the pieces of 32 years finally locking into place. She had a name, she had a motive, she had a confession waiting to happen. Now all that was left was to knock on Tom Ray's door. The warrant came through 2 days later, signed and sealed on the strength of a DNA match, a decades-old ledger, and a grieving widow's confession. Vance requested backup for 6 in the morning, when the street would be quiet enough that nothing could go wrong, and public enough that nothing could be denied. Larkspur Lane looked almost exactly as it had in the old crime scene photographs. The same narrow street, the same tidy lawns, the little blue house still standing 2 doors down from where Tom Ray's now lived out his retirement. Only the wind chimes were gone. Vance arrived with 2 patrol cars trailing behind her, their lights dark until the last possible moment, out of respect for the sleeping street. She stepped out into the cool morning air, notebook in hand, Odom's notebook, the one she'd carried through every step of this case since the day he'd handed it to her. The porch light flicked on before she'd even reached the steps. Tom Ray's opened the door in a bathrobe, gray-haired, stooped with age, blinking against the gray morning light. For a moment he looked like any other 70-year-old man disturbed too early by visitors. Then he saw the badge and something in his face changed, not surprise, Vance would later tell Odom, but relief. The look of a man finally setting down something impossibly heavy. Tom Ray's, Vance said, you're under arrest for the murder of Marissa Cole. Behind her, the flashing lights finally switched on, red and blue sweeping silently across the quiet houses of Larkspur Lane. Curtains twitched. Porch lights blinked awake one by one down the street, neighbors stepping out in robes and slippers, phones already raised, disbelief written across every face. A woman across the street pressed a hand to her mouth. A teenage boy stood frozen on his lawn, staring. Tom didn't resist. He stepped forward slowly, almost willingly, holding his wrists out before the officer even reached for them. Do you understand these rights as I've read them? The officer asked, cuffs clicking shut. I understand, Tom said quietly. Then turning his head slightly toward Vance, his voice dropped, rough with something between exhaustion and confession. You know, I used to walk past that house every single day, told myself it didn't mean anything, that I could just keep living my life. Why don't you tell me what happened that night, Mr. Ray's? Vance said carefully. Tom's eyes drifted past her toward the little blue house at the end of the street, its windows dark, its porch empty. She wasn't supposed to be that stubborn about it, he murmured, almost to himself. I just wanted her to wait just a little longer. I told her that, I begged her. His voice cracked thin and papery with age and guilt. She said she couldn't live with herself if she stayed quiet. Funny thing is, he let out a broken, humorless laugh. Neither could I, not really, not for one single day since. It wasn't a full confession, not yet. But it was close enough that Vance felt something settle deep in her chest. The same feeling she imagined that Odom must have carried for 32 years, finally easing loose. As officers guided Tom into the back of the patrol car, Carol appeared on her own porch 2 houses down, wrapped in a cardigan, watching in silence as her husband was driven away for the last time. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say that 32 years hadn't already answered. Vance stood in the street long after the car disappeared around the corner, staring at the little blue house bathed in morning light. The confession, she knew, would come in full soon enough inside an interrogation room, under the weight of the evidence she carried in her hands. The trial began 8 months later in a courtroom far too small for the size of the story it now held. Word had spread across the state, a 33-year-old cold case, cracked open by science that hadn't existed when the crime was committed. Reporters lined the back rows. Ridgewood residents, many of whom hadn't thought about Marissa Cole in decades, filled the remaining seats, whispering the way they had back in 1991, only now with an answer instead of a rumor. Ruth Cole sat in the front row, 81 years old now, spine straight, hands folded in her lap exactly the way they'd been the day she'd stood in Odom's office and begged him not to give up. She had waited 33 years for this seat. The prosecution laid out its case methodically, patiently, careful to explain each piece for a jury and a watching public who needed no scientific background to understand it. A forensic expert took the stand and broke it down in the simplest terms possible. Think of DNA like a fingerprint left behind at a scene, except this fingerprint can be compared not just to the person who left it, but to that person's entire family tree, she explained. The sample recovered from underneath Marissa Cole's fingernail in 1990, one was preserved well enough that in 2023 we could run it against a wider genetic database than ever existed before. It matched conclusively to a first-degree relative of Tom Ray's. Combined with a secondary confirmation sample taken after his arrest, the DNA belongs to Tom Ray's himself at a probability of over 99.9%. A hush fell over the room. Ruth Cole closed her eyes. The defense tried valiantly to poke holes, arguing contamination, arguing time, arguing that 3 decades in a records room could compromise any sample beyond reliable use. But the forensic testimony held firm, backed by the embezzlement records Vance had uncovered, backed by Carol Ray's tearful testimony about the letter she'd written all those years ago, backed by Diane's old statement about Marissa needing to do the right thing, even if it hurt someone she cared about. Then came Tom Ray's turn on the stand, and the story he told did not survive contact with the evidence stacked against him. He claimed at first that he'd only gone to speak with Marissa that night to plead with her one final time not to report the embezzlement. But under cross-examination, his composure, carefully rehearsed for months, began to unravel exactly the way it had on his front porch the morning of his arrest. "You said you left her alive," the prosecutor pressed. "Yet your DNA was found beneath her fingernails, consistent with a physical struggle. How do you explain that, Mr. Ray's?" Tom's hands trembled on the witness stand. His eyes flicked toward Carol, sitting near the back, her face streaked with silent tears. "She grabbed my arm," he said finally, voice barely audible. "I was trying to leave, she wouldn't let me, I just wanted her to listen to me. I didn't mean," he stopped himself, jaw tightening, 32 years of careful denial crumbling in real time. "I didn't go there to hurt her, but I couldn't let her destroy everything I'd built. I panicked." The courtroom went utterly silent. In the front row, Ruth Cole finally let the tears fall, 33 years of unanswered grief breaking loose all at once, not from surprise, but from finally hearing the truth spoken aloud in her daughter's name. The jury retired to deliberate that afternoon. It would not take them long. The jury returned after less than 4 hours. Ruth Cole gripped the wooden bench in front of her so tightly her knuckles turned white. Across the aisle, Carol Ray's sat alone, having finally, quietly filed for divorce the week the trial began. Vance stood near the back of the courtroom, Odom's old notebook tucked under her arm, the same way she'd carried it into every interview, every records room, every difficult conversation over the past year. The foreperson stood. The room held its breath. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Tom Ray's, guilty." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward through 33 years of silence all at once. Somewhere behind her, Ruth Cole let out a sound that was half sob, half sigh of relief, the sound of a mother finally allowed to stop fighting. Tom Ray's showed no reaction. He simply lowered his head, the fight gone out of him completely, as officers stepped forward to lead him away for what would be the last time. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward anyone willing to speak. Ruth Cole paused only long enough to say one thing. "My daughter waited 33 years for someone to believe her silence meant something happened to her, not that she simply disappeared from memory. Today, they believed her." Ray Odom wasn't there to see the verdict in person. His heart had given out 4 months earlier, quietly in his sleep, 3 weeks after Tom Ray's arrest made the local news. But Vance had visited him in the hospital before that, sitting at his bedside, telling him everything: the DNA match, Carol's confession, the ledger that finally explained why a quiet, unremarkable man had once stood 2 houses down from a murder and never once been asked the right questions. "You did good work, Ray," she told him. He'd smiled, tired but at peace. "We did," he corrected her. "Some cases just take longer than one lifetime to solve." Standing outside the courthouse now, watching Tom Ray's disappear into a van bound for prison, Vance thought about how true that had turned out to be. 33 years, 2 detectives, 1 notebook passed hand to hand across 3 decades. A town that had once buried its fear in gossip and easy suspicion, finally forced to reckon with a truth far closer to home than anyone had wanted to believe. Marissa Cole hadn't died because of a stranger in the dark or a scandal whispered behind closed doors. She had died trying to do the right thing, protecting people who in the end hadn't protected her back. Her only mistake had been trusting the wrong people with the truth she carried. That in the end was the quiet lesson buried inside this story, the one truth every person in Ridgewood would carry long after the courtroom doors closed. Trust is fragile. Silence has a cost. And sometimes the people standing closest to us are the ones with the most to hide. Larkspur Lane looks different now. New families have moved into the little blue house, unaware of what happened there so many years ago, or perhaps aware now thanks to the headlines and choosing to build new memories over old ones anyway. The wind chimes are back, someone put them up again, and on quiet evenings they still sing the same soft, unbothered tune they always did. Marissa Cole finally has her answer. Her mother finally has her piece. And Ridgewood finally understands what Ray Odom knew from the very first night he stood in that kitchen, that justice may be slow, but it never sleeps. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow for more true crime stories every week.